Introducing my distinguished panelists today, seated to my right is William G. Myers, Bill Myers III. Mr. Myers is the current Solicitor of the Department of Interior. He was appointed by President Bush, confirmed by the U.S. Senate. He serves as the Chief Legal Officer of the Department of Interior, providing advice and counsel to the Secretary of Interior and departmental offices and bureaus. And seated to my left is Laird Lucas. Laird Lucas is currently counsel for Western Watersheds Project and senior counsel for the Land and Water Fund of the Rockies.
I'm going to try to give you a conservation lawyer's view of the law as it pertains to federal lands grazing with a focus on the BLM. And to start at the very beginning, we start at the United States Constitution. The Constitution has a property clause which says that Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory and other property belonging to the United States. Now, we all know that the federal lands of the western United States came into federal ownership through a variety of treaties and so forth that made them federal lands. Very few people still dispute the fact that the federal government owns and can determine how to manage these lands, although there are still some, and we'd see it in places like Nevada, with folks still saying that Nevada lands are not actually federal lands, but state lands or private lands or whatever. So those disputes do continue, but by and large, I think everybody understands Congress can decide how these federal public lands are to be used in states like Idaho and other parts of the West. What has Congress said? Well, then we look at statutes that Congress has adopted pursuant to its property clause authority. Even before Congress regulated grazing on the federal lands, and the first significant regulation of grazing was the Taylor Grazing Act in the early 1930s, lands were grazed. The federal government allowed folks to graze it. But there are cases that I cite here from way back at the turn of the century, 1918, a case out of Idaho in 1918, where the courts have recognized all along that because this is federal land, folks who graze on it have a privilege to do it or a license to do it. They're permitted to do it, but they don't have a right to do it. And that goes again to this notion of property rights in grazing and in the lands. Who controls it? The folks who graze on the public lands don't have a property right to do it. We've known that since at least 1918, and it's confirmed in statutes, including the Taylor Grazing Act from 1934, which states that grazing preferences shall not create any right, title, interest, or estate in or to the lands. That was confirmed in 1976 when Congress took a comprehensive view of how BLM regulates and manages its lands and passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA. FLPMA is the basic statutory charter that governs BLM lands now. And FLPMA also provides no property right for grazing on public lands. And again, some folks still dispute that, and you will certainly hear, as I do in litigation or negotiations with attorneys for permittees, that they have grazing rights. And for instance, a case out of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit out of New Mexico just a few years ago had to again hold that you don't have a property right in grazing. And I've included in here a citation from the Court of Claims. The Federal Court of Claims is where you go if you allege your property has been taken. The government has taken your property for a public purpose. You're entitled to compensation under the Due Process Clause of the Constitution. You go file a case in the Court of Claims to say my property's been taken. In 1998, the Court of Claims rejected a permittee's arguments that their property rights were taken when BLM changed the management of their permit, and they said they should be compensated. Now this is important because it factors into things like the National Public Lands Grazing Campaign, which is offering to retire grazing allotments by paying people to do it. There's actually not a legal requirement to do that. Congress could say the lands of the western United States shall no longer be grazed, and that would be the end of it. But I don't think anybody thinks that would be fair. We recognize that traditions and businesses and families have invested a fair amount of labor and effort and value into grazing that relies on public lands. And if it's a good policy decision to retire some areas, let's go ahead and pay them. But it's not required by the law. All right, point number 3 in my handout. A permit or a lease is required to graze federal lands. This is the corollary to the fact you don't have a property right and you're out there at the sufferance of the federal government. You have to have a permit, or in some cases a lease or a license or some other kind of piece of paper that authorizes you to be out there. And again, this is set forth in FLIPMA, passed in 1976. It's been recognized in many court decisions. It's relevant because one of the themes of my talks this morning is going to be BLM is in chronic violation of the federal laws. And one of the ways they're in chronic violation is they often don't do their job, and neither does the Forest Service, in terms of issuing or reissuing permits to make sure that they're up to date and valid. And Deborah mentioned the litigation we just won in the U.S. Court of Appeals over the Waihi Resource Area. One of the things that happened there was BLM looked in the mid-1990s and realized most grazing in the Waihi Resource Area was under permits that had expired years before, or there was never a permit. In other words, up until the middle 1990s, BLM's management of livestock grazing in the Waihi Resource Area was virtually non-existent. That is, unfortunately, a pattern seen in other parts of the West. So you need a permit. All right, now to get a permit, there's other things that BLM or the Forest Service, because it issues permits too, have to do. And there's statutory mandates that Congress has set forth about how grazing is supposed to be managed. And in FLIPMA, there is what they call a multiple use sustained yield mandate. Multiple use means, of course, we use the public lands for multiple uses. It's not just grazing. It's for recreation or mining or logging or aesthetics or wildlife habitat or water quality or a variety of those things. And BLM is supposed to try to balance those, or the Forest Service. But it doesn't mean that one is more important than the other. The sustained yield mandate sits on top of that. Sustained yield is defined as the achievement and maintenance in perpetuity of a high-level annual or regular periodic output of the various renewable resources of the public lands consistent with multiple use. The Interior Board of Land Appeals in 1977, in a case brought by the National Wildlife Federation and others involving canyons in southern Utah, the Comb Wash case, interpreted this mandate of FLIPMA and other provisions of FLIPMA to say that BLM, when it's issuing permits and making land use plans, has to balance the competing resource needs and uses to ensure, and I'm quoting here, to ensure that the public lands are managed in a manner that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. Now that boils down to what we call a suitability requirement. Some lands may not be suitable for grazing because the way you mix the various uses, you may find that some areas are very sensitive. They can be adversely impacted by grazing or mining or whatever, and they should just be shut off from those uses. And the FLIPMA establishes a whole land use planning process by which BLM is supposed to go forward and think long-term about how do we manage all of these uses, and are there certain areas that shouldn't be grazed or mined or have ORVs in there? Are there certain areas we should protect as critical ecological areas? Do that planning and then issue permits under that. Well, again, that's all provided in FLIPMA, but as part of the chronic violation we see around the West, BLM has essentially never done that. They have almost never looked at systematically in their resource areas of where is it really suitable to have grazing or not have grazing. And as an example, again from the Waihi Resource Area, the Waihi BLM went through a planning process in the mid-90s. We ended up having to bring litigation to force that to be finished. But as part of that process, they had a map. It showed the areas that are excluded from livestock grazing. I'm going to show you two sides, north and south, of southwestern Idaho, the far southwestern corner of the state. It's 1.8 million acres. And I've highlighted in yellow the little places that are excluded from livestock grazing. Now, my yellow marks are much bigger than the marks on the map because I wanted you to be able to see them. But it gives you a sense of these tiny, tiny little exclosures that have been created where there's no livestock grazing, and everywhere else is subject to grazing. Everywhere else, no matter how valuable the canyons may be, no matter how valuable the sage grouse habitat may be, no matter how valuable the antelope habitat may be, it's all open to grazing. All right, back to the statutory requirements and regulatory requirements. Now, under these broad statutory commands to balance uses and make sure they're sustainable, BLM has adopted regulations, and those regulations have a number of important requirements that BLM is also supposed to meet. And one of them is authorized grazing use shall not exceed the livestock carrying capacity of the allotment. What does that mean? Well, livestock carrying capacity is the maximum stocking rate possible without inducing damage to vegetation or related resources. Well, you know, that's interesting because you put someone like John Carter up here and tomorrow he's going to tell you about how livestock grazing will damage vegetation in many, many ways, often irreparably, because it is usually improper in many of the sensitive areas of the West, riparian areas, sensitive upland areas, sage-grouse habitat, and so forth. And does the BLM look at what is the livestock carrying capacity and what is damage to vegetation? No, they almost never do this. We brought one lawsuit, which I cited in here, Idaho Conservation League and Western Watersheds Project versus Steele, which involves a Pleasant View allotment in southeastern Idaho, where BLM's biologists actually calculated the livestock carrying capacity and said, gee, we need to reduce the livestock by this amount. Politics intervened, as it always does, and BLM didn't reduce the grazing, so we had to bring suit. And we briefed this issue of livestock carrying capacity. Fortunately, BLM saw the error of their ways and settled with us, so we don't have a good court precedent to take around the rest of the West on livestock carrying capacity. But that issue is out there. And you'll be seeing more of it from folks like us and other grazing activists looking at carrying capacity concepts. Another set of the regulations are called the Fundamentals of Rangeland Health. And these were part of Secretary Babbitt's rangeland reforms after he came into office in the Clinton administration, were adopted in 1995. And they have a sweeping revision of the regulations in many ways, but the Fundamentals of Rangeland Health, for the first time in BLM regs, said we're going to meet ecological standards for grazing. And they talk about watersheds and riparian areas, sensitive species, and water quality. And if you don't meet those standards, you have to change grazing immediately. In any event, no later than the next grazing year. That's what the regulations say. Well, again, BLM's going out, and sometimes they don't find violations of these standards when truly they should, and that's a question of the adequacy of the science. But other times they find violations, and then they're under a duty to change management. But again, they don't. For bureaucratic, political, or other reasons, it doesn't happen. So we have to take them to court to enforce their own regulations, which we did in a case I've cited here that came out of the Owyhee Resource Area as well, involving the Sucker Creek allotment, took it up to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit said, yeah, BLM, you got to follow your own regulations, change grazing before the next grazing year when you're violating these ecological requirements. That's really important because the name of the game, if you're a cowboy permittee, is to keep change from taking effect. Don't let BLM ever make a decision based on new studies of the allotment. Don't ever let it take effect. Appeal it, delay it, get political interference, delay, and keep doing what you're doing. And we see that over and over again. So having the ability to enforce some kind of timing requirement is important. It's not just these statutes that deal with the management of the land. Congress has passed other statutes. Congress has passed NEPA. NEPA says federal agencies should operate in a public context. They should talk about what they're proposing to do, let the public see it. They should think about the environmental impacts and propose alternatives, and only after the public's had input, make a decision based on that. Well, back in the 1970s, it was established that, yes, grazing is an activity that has environmental impacts, so it's subject to NEPA. But again, you find BLM chronically, and the Forest Service chronically around the West, not doing what NEPA requires. They don't do full public involvement in an analysis of environmental alternatives and effects when they look at grazing. They view grazing as an ongoing activity. We've always done it that way. We're going to keep doing it that way. Nothing should change. Yet, as we've just seen, there are permits. You have to have a permit. Permits last 10 years. When that permit expires, it's a new decision. You can change the way you're managing this grazing. You should do it through NEPA. And if conditions in the land change, if you suddenly realize that you've lost sage grouse habitat through a combination of fires, weeds, human development, and grazing when you last did your NEPA 15 years ago and you didn't look at that. Well, you should look at it now. And you do NEPA when you do land use planning. And what BLM has done is back in the late 70s, early 80s, they did all these land use plans, a whole bunch of NEPA, and they essentially haven't updated it since then. Again, in the Owyhee case, we took them to court to force them to update their NEPA. The Court of Appeals has just affirmed that you do have to do NEPA, and like I say, this problem exists throughout the West of outdated, poor, inadequate NEPA analysis. There's a corollary to that, which is in 1995, the Forest Service was looking at a huge burden of renewing permits and went to Congress to get relief from it, but Congress said, all right, you don't have to do all this NEPA for all these expiring permits right now, but if you set a schedule and live up to it, that'll be okay. The Forest Service hasn't lived up to their schedule. Now we're taking them to court to force them to do that. All right, my last point is the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act applies in two important ways. All federal agencies have duties to conserve listed species, which means that they shall utilize their authorities by carrying out programs for conservation of endangered species. Unfortunately, we rarely see agencies proactively going out to try to conserve endangered species. The second part of the ESA is every federal agency has to consult with Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service to make sure that their actions, any action they authorize, fund, or carry out, does not jeopardize a listed species. There's a duty to avoid jeopardy. And that applies very broadly, and we've had to go through litigation when salmon were listed. I've cited a case in here from 1996 where an allotment up in the Bear Valley area was shut down because they didn't do consultation and the grazing would affect salmon. Now BLM is consulting largely over a lot of their stuff that they authorize, but they're not consulting over other things that they view as off limits, like their authorization of irrigation diversions on federal lands. Private people go onto BLM lands, take water off the lands to private land, and yet they use crappy old gravel diversions that block the stream, send all the water into the ditch. Fish get caught in the ditch and they die. Fish can't go up and down the stream's dewatered. It has effects, but BLM's not consulting over that. We're in litigation with them over their duties, whether they have a duty to consult over things like authorizing irrigation diversions. They don't believe they authorize them. We say they do, and this is the kind of thing that we drag them through court.
Okay, the subject of matter at hand is the legal framework for public lands ranching. Laird has given you a good overview, and we start from the same point of reference, which is the U.S. Constitution, which does provide a property clause, which does provide for Congress to have the right to decide how to use the vast public lands that we enjoy. Before I get to some of the statutes and some of the policy that I would like to discuss, though, I think it'd be useful to talk a little bit about the history that got us to this point where we are today. And in order to do that, I need to take you back about 500 years. That's when the explorer de Coronado came up from what is now present-day Mexico into the southwest United States with sheep, cattle, and horses, which was basically the introduction of livestock into this part of the continent and this part of the country. Fast forward with me now about 350 years to the Homestead Act of 1860. That was a law by which Congress decided it would be a good idea to get more Americans west of the Mississippi because there were too many other nations looking jealously at the lands out here and thinking they may want to have them. Spain, of course, France, of course, Britain, perhaps. And so through the Homestead Act, the Congress in its wisdom said, we'll give you 120 acres if you'll go out there somewhere and live and make a living. And to those eastern legislators, 120 acres sounded like a good deal. They could make a living off of a farm in the arable east. What they didn't realize is that there was no way to make a living in the arid west on 120 acres. And so the homesteading was wholly inadequate. What happened was that those homesteaders, taking advantage of the law, came out here and they looked for the best land. They were smart people. They looked for the land near the water, out of the wind, off of the side of the hill, perhaps protected by a shelter belt, and that's the land that they homesteaded. That's our bottom lands now, our private lands. They did not bother to homestead the mountainsides, the deserts, the fairly unattractive land as they saw it. And they had an understanding that having come out here and set up a homestead, they'd have an opportunity to use that land as part of their operations because they realized very quickly, of course, they'd starve to death if they tried to raise crops here, and that they would very likely starve to death if they tried to raise livestock on 120 acres. That system worked fairly well, but it was unregulated, and there was a lot of cattle baron types who would come out from the railheads of the East and the Midwest and dumped their livestock into federal lands as we know them now. And as a result, there was a good deal of unmanaged review and use of the lands. And the bigger operations pushed aside the smaller operations. They ran over top of each other. They used the grass closest to the railhead and moved on from there. That led to the passage of the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934 with the support of the livestock industry to bring some control and structure to the use of federal lands in the West. And that's where we are today, in a patchwork quilt of private and federal lands, which about half of the western United States is in federal ownership. This is a map of the state of Wyoming. I use this map because it's square and easy to handle. It also is a good illustration of that 50-50 ownership that I was just discussing. Half of the state of Wyoming is in federal lands, half is roughly in private lands. All of the color you see on this map is federal ownership of one sort or another. And this is the current world that ranchers live in and are trying to make a living based on the understanding that they had and their predecessors had from hundreds of years ago. That takes us up then to the Taylor Grazing Act of '34 and to FLTMA, which is what Laird referenced. And FLTMA has a very interesting definition of what the Secretary of the Interior is supposed to do. That she shall manage the public lands under the principles of multiple use and sustained yield. Well, what does that mean? Multiple use and sustained yield. FLTMA does define those terms. It defines multiple use as management of the public lands and their various resource values so they are utilized in the combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. There are other definitions of multiple use within the statute. Use of some land for less than all of the resources. A combination of balanced and diverse resource uses that will take into account the long-term needs of future generations for renewable and non-renewable resources, including but not limited to recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife and fish, natural, scenic, scientific, and historical values. Laird already quoted the definition of sustained yield, and I think it's important to reiterate that out of FLTMA, the achievement and maintenance in perpetuity of a high-level, annual, or regular periodic output of various renewable resources. So Congress has spoken, both in the Taylor Grazing Act and in FLTMA, that it believes that there should be multiple use of the federal lands of the West. And one of those uses it has designated as proper and appropriate is grazing. The Taylor Grazing Act actually has a very interesting statement at the beginning, which I think would be useful to keep in mind. The Taylor Grazing Act, and I like this because I think it's really quite applicable today. It shows a fair amount of forethought by the Congress of 1934. The Taylor Grazing Act states that the Secretary shall do any and all things necessary to accomplish the purposes of the Act and to ensure the objects of such grazing districts, namely to regulate their occupancy and use. That's a reference to the problems that were occurring at that time with unregulated occupancy and use. To preserve the land and its natural resources from destruction or unnecessary injury, which I consider to be an environmental element, and to provide for the orderly use, improvement, and development of the range. In other words, we have a valuable resource out there. Let's use it in an orderly fashion. Let me talk for a moment then about how we deal from this point forward with these issues. And there are two basic constructs. One is the conflict construct. The other is the cooperative approach. This Secretary and this administration believes in the cooperative approach. Advocacy groups certainly make a lot of money. They sell magazines. They raise dues off of conflict. And that applies to both ends of the spectrum, right and left, and on any issue that circulates in Washington, D.C. But it is not a good way to make policy. It is a good way to annoy people, to be unneighborly, and to basically off-put others. It is the easiest way to deal with issues sometimes. Much harder is getting together and working in a cooperative framework where you sit down with your neighbor who may, in fact, disagree with you and may do so quite powerfully. But sit down with that individual, work across the table, look at the landscape that's in question, see what needs to be done, see how it can be protected, how it can be used, and work together to try to solve the issues that are on the ground locally. Washington, D.C. is not a very good place to try to decide what to do with western public lands, quite honestly. President Eisenhower once said that if you have a pin for a plow and you're 1,000 miles from a cornfield, farming is pretty easy. There's a lot of truth to that. The point, of course, being that in Washington, D.C., people who do not understand the landscape are trying to make decisions that affect that landscape. It's much better, I believe, and the Secretary believes, to make those decisions locally, involving all sides of the local spectrum. Examples of that type of cooperation include efforts in Arizona by something called the Diablo Trust that I'm familiar with. That's outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, where ranchers there got together with environmental groups to figure out how they could best manage those lands, both for the benefit of the sustained use of those lands for ranching, as had been done for decades, and for the benefit of the resource that supported other things like wildlife. And I happened to be driving to work about 3 months ago, listening to National Public Radio, and a rancher that I know, who is part of Diablo Trust, came on, and the story was to hear him talk about how he is hauling water to his dried up stock ponds, not for the benefit of his livestock, but for the benefit of elk that are on that ranch, and that because of Jack Metzger's willingness to do this, the elk avoided death by drought. Examples also exist here in Idaho, where the BLM is working with the Nature Conservancy and private landowners on the so-called tri-state weed management area around Hell's Canyon to try to stem the tide of invasive species in the form of thistle and starweed and the like. These examples are not just rhetoric. They're people on the ground trying to deal with each other with real problems and achieve real results. I would like to also suggest that stewardship and neglect are not synonymous. I think we've seen that this year with the fire season that we've had, the worst in history, where over 200 communities across the West have been impacted negatively by the wildfires that have been raging. I flew into Boise last night, had a window seat on the side of the reservoir, 2 big fires burning. I gather one's near Loman, and the other looked like it was closer to Anderson Reservoir. I'm not quite sure where they were, but from the air they were pretty dramatic, and I thought to myself about who lives there, who's being burned out of their home and livelihood, what habitat's being lost to grazing animals and to other species. We need to actively manage the range of the BLM and of the Forest Service. There's about 170 million acres of it in the BLM's portfolio and another 100 million acres of it in the Forest Service portfolio. Active management has to be done by these land managers. It involves your stewardship and involvement, and of course it involves the ranchers, who often know that land better than anyone else in the area because they've been out there every day of the week before dawn and after sunset dealing with the issues that are affecting them. And also keep in mind that there are now about 270 million Americans. The population of the United States is moving our way, folks. The geographic center of the United States is in central Kansas, if you're looking at the lower 48, excluding, of course, Alaska and Hawaii. The center of our population is now only a couple hundred miles east of that geographic center, and it is inexorably moving this way. So it won't be long before there are more Westerners than there are Easterners. These people are going to have impacts, and so you need to think about what you want to happen out there. If you in the federal lands livestock industry, you're going to have a consequence, which means you're also going to end the private land holdings that those ranchers hold. Remember the homesteaders I was discussing earlier who took the best land out for their 120 acres? Those lands, of course, will be sold off as well, because if they're not being used for ranching, the rancher's going to have some income, and of course usually that means selling off to development. And so think about whether you would prefer to have ranching in those bottom lands or curb and gutter. And think about which one might be better for habitat, and which one's better for the local communities and the infrastructure and the traditions of this part of the country. It's, I think, telling to remember that Las Vegas means the meadows. So our choices may not be between use and no use. It may be between subdivisions and traditional use. And it definitely means that we all have to work together on these issues and try to solve them ourselves, because no one else is going to step up and do it. Thank you very much.